Good evening and welcome to our evening. This is the Bensoussan Center. My name is Robert Wistrich. I am the director of the Bensoussan Center, and we're delighted to have with us today a guest who's come from France and will talk about school in the turmoil in French schools today, anti-Semitism, the turmoil in French schools today. This is Georges Bensoussan. I will shortly give the floor to our friend and colleague Emmanuel Halperin, who will introduce him. I'd just like to say a few brief words of introduction with regard to our center and the reasons why we invited Georges Bensoussan this evening. If we look back over the last 2 years, here in Jerusalem, under the auspices of our center, we have hosted 3 guests: Bernard-Henri Lévy, Alain Finkielkraut, and Bernard-Henri Trigano. And we have the 4th figure now in this series, who will give us something a little different. He is really giving us a more direct, first-hand reportage, if you like, given by someone who's really familiar with the situation about what's going on in public schools in France, public schools in the sense of non-private schools. We can really say, I think, that the setting of a school is a mirror of the crisis that's being experienced by France, and at the same time it's a mirror of the state of anti-Semitism, where any and every Jew today has become a target in France. It's a well-known fact. We all follow the news. It's Jewish children, boys and girls alike, who suffer first and foremost, as well as their teachers at those institutions of education which have a large Arab Muslim population. So today, this situation, all of these attacks, the increasing number of attacks are really felt on that level of the school. And despite the best efforts of the French government, and we must give them credit here, it doesn't seem to me that there are any indications of the number of these attacks dropping. This anti-Semitic upsurge in the school setting is therefore the subject of our evening. Outside this auditorium, you'll find Georges Bensoussan's booklet. We've translated it into English here in-house: Anti-Semitism in French Schools, Turmoil of a Republic. And I think here you really will find an analysis, a fairly in-depth one, of what's going on, what's been going on recently. It's not by chance that we've chosen this topic, because we're not here addressing just the fate of the Jews in France. It involves a wider crisis with implications for the whole of Europe, indeed for the whole of the diaspora, and for us here in Israel. Looking out at the number of people here this evening, that reminds us that this really touches us to the quick, because it's a question of the future of the up-and-coming generation. I'll now give the floor to Emmanuel Halperin. Before I do so, however, I want to say 2 things. Obviously, I don't need to introduce him, because he's one of the best known and indeed most famous journalists in Israel. Last time we had the honor to have him with us here. I asked him, how should I introduce you? And he said, very modestly, an Uzbekistan journalist, or rather a journalist from Uzbekistan. So, without further ado, I'll say that he's a journalist from Uzbekistan who has the most amazing knowledge of French language and culture. And here is Emmanuel Halperin, who will introduce Georges Bensoussan. Thank you, Robert. What Robert and I share is that we're Polish Jews born in Central Asia. I was born in Uzbekistan, he was born in Kazakhstan. So, obviously, both of us are Israelis. The Jewish question, as you are fully aware, is of great concern to French society. It's been of concern to the French society since 1789. But for a number of years now, what we've seen is a return of the Jewish question. It's gone back to what seems to be a more and more pessimistic perspective, not just in the eyes of the Jews, but also in the eyes of the intellectuals who are trying to understand and grasp what's going on. I'm thinking, for example, of Paul Thibault's article. He's the former editor of Esprit, which has just been published in Le Débat, and in his conclusion he writes as follows: given the current state of affairs, one is justified in being pessimistic with regard to the future of a Jewry in France. One may well be pessimistic about the future of Jewry in France. What you're going to hear today, above all from Georges Bensoussan himself, I'm sure will further strengthen that analysis. An important report that's just been published in France, the Ruffin report. He's a doctor and a writer, Dominique de Villepin, the Interior Minister, commissioned to draw up a report on anti-Semitism and racism. Speaks or refers as one of the causes or factors in anti-Semitism to a radical anti-Zionism. That paragraph and section in his report is very badly accepted by a part of French public opinion or the French press, because everyone's, or Le Monde rather, gave their or said that that part of his report was provocative. The provocative report by Mr. Ruffin. Why is it provocative? Because it provokes certainly Le Monde into an attitude which may be considered to be a radical anti-Zionist. Not just Le Monde, but many other French media as well. And the Ruffin report tries to present or explain why that's the case. So, before giving the floor to Georges Bensoussan, I would like to refer to 3 anti-Semitic statements that have been elaborated recently in France and have been greatly talked about. First is this sentence: the Jews are slave dealers who have gone off to or developed into dealing with banking, show business and terrorism. That was said by Dieudonné, who's a so-called comedian, not on his TV show, but in an interview of Dimanche. He says that they are slave dealers who have branched out into banking, show business and terrorism. A second interesting sentence is one by a journalist who has been kicked out in the meanwhile, Alain Neymar, who's in charge of the international French radio. He's talking about Sharon's wall, and he said on the radio that this wall of Sharon's is a wall that's been drawn up according to the precepts of Leviticus, the Torah, and then its purpose is to separate the pure from the impure. This is a wall which is designed to separate those Jews who are pure from the Palestinians who are impure. The state of Israel continues to behave according to the precepts of Leviticus, And so obviously I don't need to explain to you, Israel is a racist state. So first of all, he was kicked out. He lost his job as chief editor on the international French radio station. The editors said, what do we look like when we criticize Israel now if the head is making overtly anti-Semitic statements of faith? So he reacted to being kicked out, losing his job, and said that he was fired because of Jewish community elements. In other words, the Jews kicked him out. So suddenly he was totally kicked out of French international radio. But what's important is that this was said by an important, well-known, influential journalist, the head of the editorial side of the French international radio. And the third thing was Brunisch, the number 3 in the French revisionist movement, who's always said he's revisionist, and he said there were no gas chambers, Brunisch, and he said certainly it wasn't more than a few 100,000 who were killed, certainly not 6 million. So he's being charged with committing revisionism. An investigation has been opened. But the question is there a common denominator between all these three? Dieudonné, a French comedian, Bruno Goenisch, a non-comedian, French, and Anna Menard, a French journalist. Now, I'm sure you can see perfectly well what they have in common, apart from the fact that they made anti-Semitic or revisionist comments. What do they have in common? They're not Muslim. They're not Muslim. They're not Arabs. They're not Islamists. Left, right, center. Not the whole of the left, not the whole of the right, not the whole of the center, but they're political figures, politicians, someone who sets opinion. I'm talking here about Dieudonné, who is certainly more influential than a journalist and who plays an important role as the voice of France, Radio France Internationale. So it's quite interesting to note that these three openly anti-Semitic positions were not adopted by Islamists or whatever. People say that this major wave of anti-Semitism is because of young people of Maghrebian background who are disadvantaged. Well, these three people certainly aren't. They're real French people, and they have different backgrounds, and they're anti-Semitic. Certainly there are young people who don't feel well in French society, and they accuse the Jews as a result of that. And we'll come back to all of this in greater detail later. But in introducing Georges Bensoussan, who is the author of an enormous and fascinating history of Zionism that was published 2 years ago, and under the name of Emmanuel Brenner, published this very interesting study on the French schools today, and there's another work coming up. I'd like to say about him that those who signed the Oslo Accords, and those who subsequently decided that they were wrong to have signed that, but there are also those who continue to support Oslo. Many of them, the most outstanding figures, have accepted that there was one mistake that they made. What's that mistake? Yossi Sarid, for example, said to me, and I think Yossi Beilins also recognized this, that mistake is not having paid enough attention to the promise made by the PLO, the undertaking entered into by the PLO, to put an end to incitement to hatred. Everything else, territorial problems and all of that, that can be discussed. But it's very odd that incitation to hatred that was laid down as one of the basic undertakings of the PLO in Oslo wasn't basically taken into account and viewed by the various Israeli governments as a major problem. And that applies both in the mosques and on the radio, but above all at school. Everything starts at school, of course. And that's why it's so important to hear Georges Bensoussan and Emmanuel Halperin about this study at school, whether we have Holocaust studies or studies of the Israel-Arab conflict. All you have to do is hear reference to the name Israel to understand that the worm is in the fruit. If we're talking about Holocaust studies, it's no longer possible to talk about Israel as an independent and legitimate state. Here, what we have, therefore, is something that has been corrupted right from the outset, that is a threat not only to the Jews of France, because we will have seen, according to the analysis of the former director of Esprit, that we have to be pessimistic, but it threatens the Republic, the very French Republic as well. And that's why Emmanuel Halperin's book is called The Lost Territories of the Republic, not of the Jews. It's the Republic which he and others, including Alain Finkielkraut and Bavot, is in danger. So the Jewish question and the Republic is a topic of long-standing. This is something which has adopted a number of different hues over time, and today it takes upon yet another form, a new and dangerous mutation, which is at the same time absolutely fascinating to analyze. And I now take great pleasure in giving the floor to Georges Bensoussan, aka Emmanuel Halperin.
Good evening, first of all, and thank you, Robert Wistrich, Emmanuel Halperin, and Simcha Epstein, the organizers of this evening, who've been working on it for many months, if I remember correctly. And as Emmanuel Halperin said, at the very heart of our discussion tonight is the school in the midst of the turmoil of anti-Semitism. Of course, anti-Semitism is not limited to schools, and Emmanuel Halperin pointed out those three spokespeople who are testimony to a very virulent anti-Semitism going on, and they are not Muslims. Should we start with an analysis of the facts, or should we simply provide several facts just to refresh your memory, although I am convinced that many of you are familiar with these incidents, and may I just remind you of a few. A young math professor just come out of teacher's school at Bordeaux. This is her first job, and she is absent on Yom Kippur. She didn't say she was Jewish, but the next day when she comes back to school, the students told her, yesterday was the day of the Jews. Is that the reason why you were not here? And she answered, no, I was taking a course. And the class sighs a sigh of relief. Oh, thank God for that. Another brief example, a cultural visit to Spain organized by the Spanish professors of schools in the Paris suburbs. And one student refuses to visit the synagogue of Toledo, saying that it is a sin. In the Quran says it's a sin to visit a synagogue. And another student said, I will go in, but I want permission to put my keffiyeh around my face because I don't want to breathe the air in this institution. Another example, in the suburbs of Paris, a young black student breaks out in tears in the corridor because she just found out that her first name, Joelle, has a Jewish origin. And to a professor who tries to console her, she says, I don't want to be taken for a Jew. And a fourth example, and I'll stop after that because we can have a whole litany of examples. In February 2003, a student of the Martinado High School is being insulted and is being told, we're going to massacre you, all the Jews, all the Yids with a... And I'd like to mention Lille as well, because, you know, these incidents are not limited to Paris or the Parisian suburbs, but Toulouse and Bordeaux much less than that. And perhaps in the course of the debate we'll see why. But in Lille, in the north, a young student in one of the best schools is being pursued by classmates who shout to her that she was a prostitute, that Hitler did not finish his job, that they were going to finish off his job, they're going to bump her off, they're going to have her gassed and burnt, etc. Well, we should say, as of now, that there are many more examples that are very recent. In the presidential campaign of Beirut in 1992 in Alsace, Beirut, perhaps you know, those who followed the French news, he was pickpocketed by a young boy, and he struck him in his face. What preceded that and what angered Beirut so much is that somebody shouted to him, "We want a France devoid of any Jews," and that's why he lost his temper. In the Val d'Isère, in 1992, a professor explains to students that the Jews were expelled from Spain, and the students applaud. Somebody else explained what is the difference between a public and private TV chain, and the student said, but this is nonsense. You know, Mr. Teacher, that the Jews are controlling television. In another class of philosophy, students say the Jews are the most dangerous people on the face of the planet. And another example, in 1993, a very good student that refuses to perform an assignment on the Holocaust. Now the question is, how can we explain this Judophobic wave, so to speak? Well, we had violent incidents in 1993 going up from 60 to 700 in 2002. Out of the total incidents, about 60 to 70% have to do with Jews and Jews alone, and only 20% have to do with Jews from the Maghreb, from North Africa, and they're of course numerically many more than the Jewish population. Between 1994, last figures we have from the CRIF and the Ministry of Interior, 94 aggressions in 4 months. In other words, the double than the similar period, the parallel period last year. And the question, who in France is more victimized by these racist attacks? Most people answer Jews. In other words, the perception of people is actually inversed as compared to reality. Less people think that Jews are victims, whereas the number of Jews who are victims of such incidents is increasing considerably. Well, these children, boys and girls alike, we should perhaps in that context mention a few facts. You know, the case of Laurent, a young student who really is undergoing terrible treatment in school until finally they say to the parents, we cannot ensure his safety, we have to take him to another school. And then the story of the Collège Montaigne, everybody knows that story. Pupils have to leave their school and go to other schools. The schools that are outside of Paris have increasing demand. They cannot actually provide enough places for all the students who want to study there. We will return to that in the debate. People want to describe France as a basically anti-Semitic country, but the facts are not as simple. The situation is not as simple as that. Rabbi Sitruk has asked the pupils not to wear the kippah in town anymore. Can you imagine? And some teachers tell their students to leave the school. And of course, security devices are now part and parcel of every Jewish school, police force around the schools to protect them. and we'll perhaps mention it in the course of the debate because our time is limited. All these means that have been taken, perhaps there is a little decline of Judeophobic. There was a little decline in the spring and summer, but unfortunately short-lived, and we are now witnessing a spectacular increase again. I will divide my presentation in three parts. The first that interests me most is to see how we have attained such a situation in France. And this goes back about 4 years ago. For 2.5 years, on the part of the intellectual and media intellectuals, we had such declarations, and this is something that we were familiar with, and my report was already published in 2002, and they wrote, this is a reality that has to be further examined. I quoted the figures. 13% in 2003, but the reality is 72% of acts committed in France, racist acts, are committed against Jews. How can one explain that? Perhaps the first answer would be that as always, we seem to mix past and present. However, we have to see that for many intellectuals in France, they seem to be still stuck in the 80s, the 90s with the anti-Maghrebian reaction, very profound racism against people coming from North Africa. This is something that's undeniable. This is the reality of France that one has to contend with. However, aggressions against people coming from the Maghreb are on the decrease, considerable decrease. In other words, there's a great thrust in anti-Semitic acts, whereas a decline on anti-Maghreb incidents. And intellectuals have kept mum on this. And why? Because they can hardly imagine that people who are victims of racism can perpetrate racism to somebody else. They really believe that a victim and an assassin cannot coexist in one and the same person. But this is exactly what happens. This is something that they cannot imagine. They cannot imagine that a victim of racism can become a racist. This is, of course, a very simplified approach. And, of course, they keep saying, how can a Semite be an anti-Semite? But Le Monde has played a very important role in this misinterpretation. This is the opinion-making newspaper. It is the daily newspaper in France. But Le Monde took 2 years to actually bring the fact. It kept mum on the, for instance, on internet sites, Muslim internet sites that call for a destruction of the Jews. And last year they had an inquiry on a Jewish site, which was really very racist site, but that they were very happy to do, whereas there's so many sites, Muslim sites, that do the same and much worse, and they just kept mum about that. You know that in Le Monde there are several opinions, Plenaire, Colombani, and but there are several voices heard in the newspaper. The third element among the teaching corps in France, there's also latent anti-Semitism, and teachers are scared. Teachers are scared. Many professors, many teachers have spoken to us. Only 10 have agreed to testify, and many refused to reveal their names. And in the second edition of my report, there are 13 contributors. 10 of them are appearing under a pseudonym. they are really scared. When I say that they keep a very low profile, I'll give you a couple of examples. They say that they don't want to provoke incidents, and so they don't want to provoke the students. Others say, let's avoid the courses where problems can arise. And when they are asked about it, they say the Dreyfus Affair, because it deals with anti-Semitism, even the Hebrew people in the beginning of school, and of course the Shoah, as controversial subjects. Only one example which was brought to us, and we have met Minister Ferry as well and Minister Fillon recently, but the teaching corps is really scared. And I'll give you the example of one teacher in 2002, non-Jewish, history professor who called and said, listen, this is what's happening in my school. I wanted to invite Ida Greenspan, a survivor of the Holocaust, to speak in history and philosophy classes. And all the other teachers opposed it. They said, we don't want to have any problems here in the beginning of the school year. We have many Arab students, and they refused. And they added, if you want to invite someone who was deported in the war but is not Jewish, it'll be okay. This denial, this refusal to face the truth, to face reality on the part of many intellectuals might be explained in the following manner. And I'm speaking now not about teachers, but about intellectuals who took so much time to realize, they say, to realize the situation. As far as they're concerned, this did not take place because it could not take place. Why? Because it should not have taken place. And this is really the key element of the story. Remember, the communist intellectuals in the 50s and the 60s, at the times of Kravchenko, they said the Soviet camps did not exist. This is a calumny. They could not exist, and that's why they should not exist, and hence they do not exist. It is part of an imperialistic campaign, etc. You're all familiar with this trend. Now, who are the authors of these acts? Well, those who perpetrate such acts in schools. We know that many of them take place not within the school, but on the way to school or from school. According to the Rifa report, and this is the only point where I disagreed with the report that Emmanuel Halperin quoted before. Most of the perpetrators are young people from the Maghreb, North Africa. No matter what we say, we might say that this is politically incorrect, but the facts are obstinate, as Lenin would put it, and they are here. It is not the words of Golnisch or others who perpetrate these acts, but rather that particular segment of the population. In other words, we have to face this reality that's really difficult to admit. An important point in the history of France and history period. It is the problem of the equation between facts and beliefs. In other words, everything seems to say that the facts are mistaken and ideology is right and the facts are mistaken, or the facts are crooked. And in this new anti-Jewish thrust, at least in the last 3 years in which we lost a lot of time, it was this intellectual pattern that carried the day. Some say that, but if you speak about the political trends, anti-Semitic trends in France today, you stigmatize France as a whole. But when one speaks about anti-Semitic trends in France in the 30s or in the 40s, did that mean that the whole of France was being stigmatized? No. It was those currents or those trends that were stigmatized, not France as a whole. France is not anti-Semitic as per se. And this is a kind of generalization that should, of course, be avoided. This is a rather simplistic approach, but the situation is very complex today in France. One might mention, when we speak about the origin of the aggressors, and as we know, they do not stem only from the extreme right, Many of them come from Arabic people of Arabic origin. So we neglected to see that because for a very long time we thought that the left was defending the Jews ever since the Dreyfus Affair. But one should bear in mind that before the Dreyfus Affair, we had an anti-Semitic left in France, at least in part. In the beginning of the Dreyfus Affair, we had a left that found it very difficult to come to the defense of Captain Dreyfus, and because he was considered a bourgeois. And in 2004, 110 years later, again, the question that arises, how can accuse a victim by definition of being a racist? How is that possible? How is it possible to accuse the victim of perpetrating racist acts? And that silence, of course, is perhaps characteristic to some countries like France. This is like a new language. They're speaking about people who are disinherited or people who are socially challenged, as would be the correct term. Well, does that give them permission to arson a synagogue? And then there are those, of course, who claim that the source of all these acts, anti-Semitic acts, are the acts of Sharon. But of course, it started in the year 2000, when Ehud Barak was the prime minister, and the climax was in 2000 and not in 2002. So when Sharon came to power, there was a decline, only to be renewed later on. And then, of course, people entertain the feeling that the aggressors should not be punished because they are victims. They are victims of racist approach, and that, so to speak, gives them rights and no obligations to the republic and to civil rights and civil ideas, civic precepts. Another example of this langue neuve, of this new language, is the civic lack of courage, if you want. People are afraid to say that the king is naked, as the story goes, because they're afraid that they would be labeled as fascists or racists. And of course, what encourages this very liberal, so to speak, approach to these aggressors and aggressions is that it is a climate in which every impulse is described as a deep reflection, deep thinking. There is an intellectual climate of sorts in France and in Europe. A poll in France showed that many people say that Holocaust deniers should not be punished because denying the Holocaust is just a political opinion, just like any other. There was no you remember the time after the Copernic, the incident of the Copernic and the Rue de Rosière, etc. But there has been since many surges. And of course, again, we cannot just content ourselves by saying France is anti-Semitic. But this notion and this approach has made us lose precious time. And people did not try to address the Maghrebin people, and many of them do try to integrate themselves in the French Republic. But however, the fact that many of them do not make that effort and are the perpetrators of such acts, of course, stigmatize the people of Maghreb origin. And instead of saying some people of the Maghreb origin are perpetrators. People tend to say the people originating from the Maghreb are the perpetrators of such acts, and like any generalization, it is wrong. It is a minority, not majority, and of course to say the people of Maghreb origin would be erroneous and unjust. Uh, Not qualifying the perpetrators for what they really are, not qualifying them as real anti-Semites is in fact understating them, because one does not demand of them what one demands of any other French citizen. In other words, it causes an approach to them which holds that they are not really French. They're not real French people. And so their feeling of being victims is only being strengthened. They are only French on paper, not real French. And in the name of anti-racism, if you condemn the young people of the Maghreb, you would be a racist yourself. So, and of course, one has to be very careful. And whatever the origin of the actors at play, we are witnessing a racist thrust in France.
Halperin said earlier, and this is so true, that this anti-Semitism is no longer limited to the Maghreb context or settings in France. Some Maghreb communities are considered to set the powder alight. But as Emmanuel Halperin said earlier, quoting Dieudonné, one doesn't use the term juif, Jew, otherwise you can be punished by the law. You talk about Zionist. June 2004, there's a meeting. Zionism goes too far, it's excessive. It wants everything for itself. And when a French Zionist Jew tells you, and so on and so forth, and then later he talks about the psychopathology of Zionist Semitism. So the clever thing is never to use the word Jew on its own, always to use the word colonist. Otherwise, you will fall under the law and you can be charged with being racist. Another thing here involves the question of political resentment and the whole general idea that has really nurtured this anti-Semitism. I don't have time to go into all of the details here, but there's social precariousness, there's mass unemployment, which has really gnawed away at the fabric of French society. We have this floating phenomenon. France is really like living on the edge of a volcano. Many people have said this. This is very obvious in France. So when I say that people are just dying to do something, that is to do something anti-Semitic. Why? Because for several decades following the Shoah, anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic acts became a taboo. You couldn't be anti-Semitic after Shoah. It became a taboo, and therefore the Jew instantly became the perfect target of offenses. And when the memory of the Holocaust, the Shoah, loses its force because it's a memory of the establishment, of those who were established, then there's a kind of corrosive effect. And instantly, and this is the dreadful thing for the millions of victims, the Shoah becomes the symbol of a form of a moral conformism. And obviously, the young anti-Semites and Judeophobes today have instantly a perfect target for their hatred. You can find the community falling back on itself and closing ranks. But what happens? You get a kind of vacuum in the housing estates. There's an absence of identity. These young people from the Maghreb don't know who they are anymore, not Berbers, not blacks, not Maghrebians. This is a real vacuum, and anti-Semitic acts find a perfect place there. They fall on very willing ears. There's this real social resentment, and those people then adopt classical anti-Semitic terms, and they refuse not only the Jews but also France. A little anecdote: in the Isère, there was a teacher who wanted Le Château de ma Mère by Marcel Pagnol to be studied by his students. They said, no, it's too French for us. It's foreign to us. We don't want to study it. So what's going on here? This can only be understood if one agrees that one mustn't one has to accept that there's this link. We have probably 4 to 6 million people from the Maghreb, or with a Maghreb background. You can't take them away from the history of the Maghreb and the history of migration as such. If you make that disconnection, then you don't understand. And that's what happens in the media now. They focus on the Intifada, Palestinian, Jewish issues, and they say that's where it comes from. Even if peace was signed tomorrow, the anti-Jewish wave would continue. The figures from Kriv, as confirmed, or the figures from Kriv and the Ministry of Education confirm that this attitude, this anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist feelings, has nothing to do with the actual clashes between Jews and Palestinians here. Let me explain what really is going on here, the way I understand it. The wave of anti-Jewishness with a Maghreb background cannot be understood unless you understand and refer to the colonial Maghreb and the pre-colonial Maghreb. You have to consider the Quranic teachings, the dhimmi status, and the pre-colonial Maghreb, where the Jewish condition was largely one of the oppressed. If you look at the Jewish archives, Morocco, pre-912 in Paris, then you can get an understanding of the Jewish condition in Morocco. That aspect has been forgotten. Secondly, this Arab-Muslim community, such a large one, doesn't live in isolation. It has links with the Arab and Muslim world. It's linked through the television, the internet. It's linked by the media. 2,300,000 homes get Almanach in France with all of the programs that it broadcasts. So that population is very sensitive to what's going on in Chechnya, Iraq, Palestine. It's very much affected by what's going on. And it's quite obvious that in this respect, it's this immigration which has played the role of the detonator in setting off this wave of Judeophobia in France, even though once the valves were open, others took up the relay. Now, if we look at the Arab-Muslim approach, it's something, there's a man called Deningre who said, look, since 74, there hasn't been any more immigration. What does the Ministry of the Interior say at the beginning of 2004? A report from the Population Immigration Directorate. Legal, I stress, immigration, in other words, with a residence permit for more than a year, has gone up 36%, then 113,000 legal immigration entries in 2003. Now, of that, 63% come from the Maghreb. And I would remind you that Chirac, when visiting Algiers in March 2003, was heckled. The number of people from the Maghreb doesn't change what I've said. The French keep saying there are no more immigrants coming in, but that's wrong. That's a real lie. And the 21st of April 2002, there was an incident when they kept saying they're not letting anyone else, whereas we know perfectly well that immigration is a phenomenon which continues to exist in France. Is it to be racist to say this? If you use the term immigration today, then you are setting foot in very dangerous territory. But basically, if you want to avoid trouble, well, go off and become a market gardener. It's much safer. If you look at the Arab-Muslim elite, they have become integrated. It's an excellent thing in France. for the Jewish community as well. But certain people are profiting from their position to set out on rather delicate ground, and I won't go on for too late. I know time is going on. One of the senior officials in the Ministry of Justice, Vidal, who was appointed to a Muslim council in 2001, published a book which wasn't particularly well received at that time. It looked at two individuals, Ramadan and Hussein. Hussein a week ago produced a cassette, Palestine, the History of Injustice, and that cassette is sold in all the major Islamist shops or bookstores. There are two sentences in French in the cassette. The Persians, Romans, Christians killed a lot of Jews because they're the ones who live among them, who consider the others like sheep who have to serve them as slaves. And they use the others only for the purpose of extortion, and they published usury in the Jewish religion. There's a theory saying that the Jews are the chosen people and the others are there to serve them, the others are animals. And a little later, second and last quotation, the Jews have no pity. They teach their children from their earliest age that they have to kill the Arabs. I won't give you the text because you would vomit. And according to the rabbi's fatwa, to kill an Arab is to go to paradise. Now that is from a cassette which is being duplicated and sold in the hundreds of thousands. It's been complained about. The cassette goes back 3 years and it's never been stopped. So I think that if you start reasoning about anti-Semitism at the school and outside the school in France today, just within the narrow borders of France, that's wrong, because it looks as if the borders are impermeable. But it's not true. Borders don't count anymore. You've got internet, you've got cable, and all of those who haven't integrated properly are basically being got at by all sorts of people who target them. There are imams in mosques who make the most dreadful statements in the mosque. The proof is that when you're in contact with Krif, it's Krif that tells you that the RGs are more worried. The RGs are helping their people, they're infiltrating the mosque and helping their people to learn Arabic. There's a certain Islamism which is also prevalent in certain suburbs that it's a form coming from Pakistan and Afghanistan. It's a very virulent form. Also, not the image of not only the Jew has deteriorated, but also of the women. And people talk about green fascism. There's an Islamist fascism. There's an amazing text that we received from Grenoble in July 2004 from a non-Jewish Christian French student from BTS who explains how the class is split into two, the Muslim pupils on one hand and the others on the other. You have Islamist attacks in the hospitals. Gynecologists says they can't work properly. They're being attacked. They don't have the right to examine Muslim women and so on. And even when the mother's life is in danger, they're not allowed to intervene. It's 8:25. How much longer do I have? No, it's 8:38. Sorry, 7:38. Okay, 5 minutes just to conclude. Two things. The first is that this anti-Semitism, the trigger for which was Arab Muslim, is to a large extent the heir of a long-standing tradition which pre-exists Arab immigration. But at the same time, the victimization which has surrounded this community of an Arab Maghreb background has nurtured minorization. It's as if the Maghreb immigrant has never been considered to be an equal. Back there they were natives, now they're victims. In other words, they went from being scorned to being compassionate, but they're not considered equals, these people from the Maghreb. And on that level, this type of attitude has led to, it's wreaked havoc, basically. That's the first thing. The second point, and this will be my conclusion, you will have what you understand is a very short conclusion, very curtailed, because we really don't have much time. We're keeping a number of important points for the discussion, but I want to conclude on 3 important points in my conclusion. So, I believe that the current Judeophobic wave in France at the moment, in school and out of school, and the school is simply the most obvious sign of what's going on in French society. There are 3 sources to this phenomenon. The first one, I thought that the Maghreb immigration did give a signal, and there's a kind of dialectic here. The first source, the French ultra-left. Very often, between the Greens and the French ultra-left, you find the same ideological trajectory, the end of communism, the end of revolutionary utopia, and the end of the organized left. And I think that if you take all those factors, they led to a messianic third worldism, which meant that since the proletariat has vanished, the salvation is to be found through the Palestinian cause. So the Palestinian cause has become the new sacred cause, which goes far further than Palestine, the Jewish question, or the Middle East, because it's like the poor versus all the oppressors in the world. The ultra-left is often forgotten here, links up with the long tradition of the French left before the Dreyfus affair, where anti-Semitism was swallowed up by the social struggle. The Dreyfus affair doesn't only concern the left, but even there's a whole tradition of anti-Semitism of the French Communist Party. Remember how Tory spoke about Blum back in 1940. So if you start there, the figure of José Bové and very borderline anti-Semitism of that left, José Bové, who said in Liberation about the wave of anti-Semitism, he said, we have to ask who benefits from the crime. I denounce what's going on here, but I think that the Israeli government and its secret service have created a certain psychosis to believe that there is an anti-Semitic atmosphere that has been set up or generated in France in order to distract attention from what's going on in France. Finkelkraut and Deliev have analyzed all of this beautifully, and this gives rise to this ideological monster which Finkelkraut calls the nice anti-Semites, being a little sarcastic. They're nice when it comes to anti-Semitism, but we can really ask whether we're really looking at something very new. We can ask whether what we see here is really any different from what we had before. Before 45, the Jew was did not belong to the human race. He was therefore not part of mankind. If you go back to the Aryan myth in the 19th century, you had race. After Hitler, after 45, race was discredited after the Shoah, so the Jews were the only real bearers of the race, and that's because the proof is they've created a racist apartheid state. So the Jews are racist. And lastly, if you take this reasoning, if the Jew is the principle of evil, then it's very simple. The bearer determines the principle of the evil has changed, that's all. Another aspect, old French anti-Semitism, which was thought naively to have disappeared in 45, well, if you go back to 37, Begin published a book, and 100,000 books were sold in a couple of weeks. Drummond before that with French, La France Juive, was very successful as well. That means that traditional form of anti-Semitism was just slumbering. It was certainly there, but it was under the table, if you like. But there are 2 aspects we have to take into account. One, the rejectionist extreme right, and the climate that's been favored by this Maghreb immigration. And that's why someone from Grenoble has been able to make his comment about the gas chambers. Then there's another branch, the Christian one, particularly the so-called progressive Catholic one, to support the Palestinians is to go back to the Passion of Christ and the death of Christ on the cross. So you will have all of this Christian imagery here. And I think if you go back to Ramallah last spring, you have this image again. And then there's another aspect, which is the most important. This is what broke the taboo in France. It was a real taboo about anti-Semitism and the Shoah, but that was broken by this third source. That's the Arab dimension of France today. Look at Israelophilia in 60s, 70s, Israelophobia now. An inspector was telling me this 3 days ago with regard to a symposium on the conflict in the Middle East. He said, I agree to have this symposium, but, and I know this Inspector General, who certainly is absolutely devoid of any anti-Semitism, but this Inspector General of History said, you can't use the word Zionism. Zionism gives rise to polemics. He said, that's the word you mustn't use. So you look at that, and there are a number of sources here. Arab Muslim immigration, even though it's not totally responsible, it's certainly, I would insist on this point, and it's certainly there forever in France. It's probably the most important carrier or bearer of this. So if you look at these courses, there's one involving revendications. There's the Ruffin report. It doesn't entirely agree with this. It says that the new anti-Semitism, I'm quoting here, is not a Maghreb special aspect. What is striking in the Ruffin report, when you read it properly, is what follows up here. A couple of lines later, Ruffin writes, one must be careful not to take these young people and say that they are by definition and almost legitimately bound to criticize and attack the Jews. And then a few pages later, Ruffin accepts that there is an imported form of anti-Semitism. I stress imported form of anti-Semitism. And it's Ruffin who makes that point. And then, and this is the other point where I agree with Ruffin, we know that it's not always the case that if there's integration, there'll be less violence, true, but even if they're integrated, it doesn't mean to say that they'll stop being anti-Semitic. So there one disagrees with Ruffin part. Political reality, and this will be the last thing I'm going to say, the political realities in Paris today, just to look at the spirit of the time, which doesn't apply throughout France, but it's leading to a divorce between the Jews and the Republic. And Halperin referred to Paul Thibault's very nice article, which I may refer to later, when he says the future of French Jewry is not assured, and Thibault is far more pessimistic than us. But to give you an idea of the spirit of the times, when there was a French-Palestinian rally, and there was a banner that said the future of peace in Europe goes via the Middle East with Palestine. It says that if you don't take care of the Middle East, you will have war in French cities. Civil rest, as opposed to unrest in France, depends on finding a solution to the Palestinian situation. Dieudonné did what he did, and that led to an unleashing of anti-Semitism, and various Jewish speakers, Strauss-Kahn, Finkel, Kroth, Adler, who had absolutely they got the maximum number of catcalls and boos. The names were booed by a furious crowd. If I called it a crowd that was absolutely having a wonderful time, I wouldn't be overdoing it. For history and historians, sadly, there are many memories of the past that are aroused and awoken here. One mustn't stigmatize the Maghrebians. I've said one mustn't stigmatize the Poles. I would remind you of what was said before the war. The Jews, the Jews are less isolated than they were before. They have the support of the Polish democracy, which is becoming consolidated. That was following a pogrom in mid-30s in Poland. One has to add to its roots even more aspects. I'll just do this very briefly, and I am finishing. One is the Western feelings of guilt with regard to the Shoah led to a taboo, but now the valves are open for a phenomenon here because of what's going on in Israel, the Satanization of Israel, certainly the taboo of the with regard to the Holocaust, the Shoah has come to an end now. One can certainly say after 45, the Jews could say the following: they will never forgive us, Auschwitz. That's one of the real truths of this wave of Judeophobia now. And then there's this question of disalienation. The West, with the state of Israel and with Zionism, is really losing its scapegoat, its victim, and its scapegoat. And in losing the victim, it is being destabilized. So I think today, what we're seeing today, and Thibault says this, and unfortunately, I don't really disagree with him, what we may be witnessing, and no one can be sure here, and we may be wrong, it can't be clear cut here, but I do believe that perhaps what we have is, what we're seeing is a slow process of Jews turning their backs on French citizenship for the reasons I've referred to. And if anyone doubts about this, I refer you to what Ruffin says very cleverly and very subtly in his report. He says the distinction between racism and anti-Semitism. And this is a distinction that recently organizations didn't want to accept, because yes to anti-Semitism is very specific, particularly in today's France. Racism refers, Ruffin says, above all, to going into citizenship. For example, racism with regard to the Arabs. Anti-Semitism talks about going out of citizenship for people who for centuries, or at least for decades, have been part of the social body. And this is precisely where current thinking in France is coming up against. It cannot really get a grasp of these terribly complex, very heterogeneous phenomena in France, for which we have no really simplistic responses.
Thank you, Bensoussan, for your brilliant analysis. So rich that it did not allow us to really taste all the nuances of what is taking place in France today, because we're so limited in time. It is very complex and at the same time very simple. Since, like you said at the end, is it the very same thing? Another shape, another mask, but still the old anti-Semitism. It is still very interesting to analyze it, as you have said, but it is a phenomenon that we are familiar with, not all of us maybe, but we perhaps are not familiar with it in our own lives, but through books that we read, or historically speaking, ever since the French Revolution. There is a point that I noted in your brilliant lecture, Georges Bensoussan, the fact that people who are familiar with anti-Semitism take a pseudonym, take a mask, they fear. And in parallel, one can see that people who support the Jewish cause insist on saying that they're not Jews themselves. There's a book that just has been published in France by Michel Vinocq, a well-known sociologist, France and the Jews, presents in as honest a way as possible the history of the relations between Judaism and the Republic, France and its Jewish communities. And Michel Vinocq, in an introduction, finds it necessary to mention that he has had a Catholic education. It is not evident. He does write it so that we should know that he is not part of Jewry, of Judaism. And the same goes for the Ruffin report that we have sanctioned because it is really remarkable. One may discuss one point or another in that report, but he speaks about the importance of the effort in this struggle, and he says, who are the artists who mobilize to struggle to put an end to famine in Africa, for instance? Where are the people of Carpentras or Chambon-sur-Lyon? When Chirac speaks about that, he tries to convey a message to the Jewish community, but who hears that message other than the Jews, perhaps? And campaigns where the slogans are, whoever you are, don't touch the Jews of France. If there was such a campaign, but there isn't. Many non-Jewish intellectuals in France would not mobilize. And Ruffin, who writes this in the introduction to his report, just a small sentence, stresses that he is French born and bred. In other words, he feels the need to sort of detax himself. In other words, he says, I'm going to write a report on anti-Semitism, but know that I am not a Jew. I am a French of French origin, an ancestry. What we heard, of course, is quite catastrophic. For him to say that he is a real born and bred French excludes the Jews from being able to say that. And we do know how many Jews who have been living in France for centuries or for many generations keep saying that they are also French bred and born, but this seems to be excluded through this report that is supposedly written to struggle against anti-Semitism in France, which only reflects the complexity of the situation. When Léon Blum was prime minister, and he would never react to anti-Semitic comments made to him, addressed to him, and that were sometimes quite violent, up to physical attacks. He was physically attacked, and then people say, but a president of France will never be a Jew. And today, the contenders to succeed Chirac are Jewish. And I don't think that the majority of French people would oppose that. But things are complex. They're very complex. But there is not a complete and total rejection of Jews from being elected president in France. Well, it hasn't been achieved yet, but it is not impossible. The main contenders today, both on the right and the left, are Jews. So, and I'd like to give the floor to Simcha Epstein immediately. I'd like to quote a sentence from that book of Emmanuel Halperin, who is no other than Georges Bensoussan, a sentence that's now repeated everywhere. The Jews of France are more and more inclined to perceive or be perceived as Jews in France, not of France, but in France. They're not Jews of France, not French Jews, but rather Jews in France. And they perceive themselves as a community where as people are trying to put that stamp on them, that stamp of a community that many of them rejected and refused for so many years. As Emmanuel Halperin said it, less than 25% of the Jews of France participate in community life, Jewish community life. Are they Jewish French or French Jews, or and sometimes they have no connection to any community establishment whatsoever, but they are now communitized, if you wish, categorized as a community, and they are assimilated to the new immigrants. It is a community that has come from the outside. These are Jews in France and not of France. And the question ought to be asked, for how much longer? Simcha Epstein, that you all know, who teaches here at the Hebrew University and works at the Vidal Sassoon Center, wrote an extraordinary book called the Pro-Dreyfus People Under the Occupation. It has been awarded the prize of the Académie Française, the French Academy. And as you can see, this prize is awarded even to people who present the French intellectuals under an rather unfavorable light. Anyway, Simcha Epstein follows their career, those pro-Dreyfus people, up to the time of the occupation, and many of them has gone over to anti-Semitism and to the extreme right. This is perhaps what he's going to talk to us about. I'm not sure. But this is a recurring phenomenon in France. A wave and another wave, and then perhaps a last one, a last wave. Thank you. Thank you, Emmanuel. There are many books who were written on these waves of the last recent years, at least 15 books, perhaps 20. And they are varied. Some are an outcry of protest, some are a detailed analysis. You really have the whole range of the whole diversity of books. It's quite a lot, 15 to 20, and there's one that outdid all of them. One that when you read it, and it's happened to many of us here, when you read it, you understand that this is the book of that wave, of that crisis. It is a book that's different from other books, and it is the book written by Emmanuel Brenner, The Lost Territories of the Republic. It carries a weight that goes well beyond that of all the others still being important books, interesting books, but this one really outdoes all of them. It is very clear that this book will remain the symbol of the crisis. It is that book that will be referred to in 10, 20 years ago when one will speak about the crisis of the years 2000 in France. It is clear, it is impressive. It is a book that really outdoes all others. And George, it is very important that the book was written. It is very important that you took that initiative, and as we say in Hebrew, in a very friendly way, kol hakavod, more power to you. I think really this should be said. This book is so strong because it is at the same time factual, because it introduces us into those schools which are at the very heart of crisis, school that is supposed to be the place where children live, are supposed to learn coexistence, and here they are witnessing a barbaric act, perhaps virtual barbarity in a slightly euphemistic way, but still, can one expect to convey in schools the message of the Shoah so that people understand that no one should harm the Jews anymore or any other person? And it is no chance that most criticism is addressed to the teaching of the Shoah, and what you have shown with really with extraordinary subtleness and honesty is the way the teaching core is reacting, how they try to live with that kind of violence, not to speak about it. It's very easy to avoid talking about something, and if you don't talk about it, nobody will come and demand that you talk about it. So there is a syncretic approach to violence in a very anodyne manner that has nothing apocalyptic, but there are all the elements of apocalypse on a small scale. Really on a small scale, there is really the total fear of ones, the violence of others. All the elements are there. The hypocrisy of some and the elements are there still on a small scale, and the crisis can still be lived. But it's true that incidents have been on the increase, and the present crisis is the strongest that we have witnessed since 1945. Uh, it is increasing in intensity from one crisis to another, and it is quite likely that the next crisis will be even more, even stronger, even more intense, and all the data point out in that direction. There is an extreme right that has taken 15% of the vote, extreme left as well, that is still very hostile to Jews one way or another, and of course the Maghreb community. All these are stable factors that are there to stay and even to increase. So, and they are even going to multiply and to increase even further in intensity. And so this book shows all of that. This book shows all that, and hence its importance, which is not only an intellectual importance, but also a historic one. This book is a very important one. I'd like to touch on one point of for this entire debate, and to do so very briefly. You said to come out or to go out of citizenship. You mentioned an article where someone says with fear that maybe the Jews are approaching a stage where they will have to turn their back on or to abandon French citizenship. And that is the moment where I said to myself, there's something good in this. There is a ray of light, the silver lining in this cloud. For some, quitting citizenship means that the Jews will open that debate of substance that we have always waited for, to react to the, we've seen reactions to the crisis, we've seen confusion, but we have not seen the ideological debate on the substance that we're still waiting for, and Jewish history waits for, on the question, who are we? Are we French? Yes or no? Who are we? To what people do we belong? Are we French or are we Jewish? And the question to know whether the Jews are in France or of France is very clear. The Jews are in France and not of France. And we know where they come from. Technically, they come from Morocco, Poland, Algeria, etc., but they're not really from all these places. Lithuania or others, Tunisia. The Jews of France are from here. They belong to the ancient people that started its march in history more than 3,000 years ago. For them, the French chapter in their history is only a brief chapter, which nowadays is confronted with the classical problem of Jewish communities in exile. It is the same problem of 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, when there is a classical situation, perhaps one that arouses despair, but nevertheless a classical one that Jews have had to face always. And the question is, why the Jews of France? And it's a question that I address to you. You wrote a very good history of Zionism. These are notions that are very familiar to you. Why this debate? Why this debate has not taken place so far? This debate on the substance. Why, if there are reactions of confusion or Zionistic reactions, why are they expressed only indirectly in the social field and not politically overtly? Jews talking to Jews. Why? Why is there this block with Jews, this mental block, whereas the situation, according to any objective criteria, is propitious to launch such a debate and to open such options? Why is this not happening, George? And here I'd like to have your opinion. I think it would be important for you to pronounce your opinion on this?
Well, there's a question that Georges Bensoussan has to reply to in a few minutes. After Robert Wistrich, whom you're all familiar with, who's the director, the chair of the International Center for the Study of Antisemitism, he's going to, it's not a question, obviously, of closing the debate, certainly not, but perhaps it's a question of adopting a higher or a more distant view, should we say. Maybe it's a question of taking a view of the dispersion stretching over to millennia and looking from that point of view at what's going on in France. Just one thing, in order to modulate the extremely Zionist comments made by my colleague Simcha Epstein, it's important to note that today that the French authorities and certain French political parties, almost all of them, in particular the President of the Republic, Jacques Chirac, do not allow a single opportunity to pass, not only to indicate their outright condemnation of anti-Semitism, but also their terror of a flare-up and a growth in these acts of hatred and violence. And this can be summarized in a form of words used by Jacques Chirac. Whoever touches a Jew will have to deal with the Republic. I think here there's an awareness, which may have come late, Georges, but it's there. Better late than never. Certainly been there for at least a year. An awareness that has developed that it's the Republic in its values and its very foundations that is in danger. And it's this Republic that must be protected, that has to be safeguarded through a pitiless, uncompromising struggle against anti-Semitism. In France, not only are there allies, not just allies because they're not anti-Semites, but, or not to say philo-Semites, but because they have a very interest on behalf of the Republic in fighting against anti-Semitism. It's a vital interest on their part, and that's something that's important to remember. It's not just that we have France within its borders, which is absolutely at prey to anti-Semitism. No, it's not true. There is a state. There's the action taken by Sarkozy in the education ministry, the Ruffin. It's not purely by chance that the Ruffin report has been commissioned and has come out this way. If you go to the French Education Ministry site, what hits you in the face is the Ruffin report, which is absolutely vital for France today. France, Republican France, France in power, considers that the struggle against anti-Semitism is something absolutely vital. And that was not the case for other French states prior to the Second World War. Robert Wistrich. Thank you, Emmanuel. And thank you, above all, Georges Bensoussan, who really has met all of our hopes with that outstanding presentation. I don't know whether I'm really capable that's been described here this evening in part. There's certainly a crisis of French national identity, but this crisis certainly exists over and beyond the French borders. It's a European crisis. I would even go so far as to say it's a world crisis. The problems that are posed by the rise of radical Islam, the problems resulting from the problems of fundamentalism, are increasingly global ones. And you have processes of globalization which are underway and have been underway for a number of years now in a number of countries, and they, I believe, are engendering some of the problems that have been discussed here this evening. Emmanuel asked about the question, the flare-up, the recurrence of anti-Semitism. For a researcher such as myself, who tries to focus on anti-Semitism over more than 2,000 years, there are always elements which come back time and time again, including in the analysis that we've heard this evening. If I had, using a joke, to summarize this recurrent element, I would refer to, or I would quote a French Jewish songster, Serge Gainsbourg, unfortunately, is no longer with us, who said in 7 words in French everything that had to be said. He asked the question, who sank the Titanic? The reply was, iceberg. A Jew. Iceberg, a Jew. I think that's one of the keys to the problem today. It may well be the Maghrebans in French schools who, through a number of ways, perhaps through their family, through the handing down of a certain cultural heritage from the Maghreb that's been referred to here this evening, which is certainly very important because there's this whole history of dimitude, this despising of the Jew. There's a whole history that certainly existed in Maghreb society even before they came to France. There are those who preach hatred, the preachers of hatred, the imams, there's this Salafism, there's Wahhabis, the mosques, which are in so many parts of France. What have they learnt then? What's their image of the Jew? It's not so different from all of this classical anti-Semitism that we've been familiar with for centuries on centuries. The Jews are the cause of all of the mishaps, the evils, the adversities, all the wars. The Jews are responsible for the wars. The Jews who plot Jewish conspiracy, Jewish plot, the protocols of the elders of Zion, which have come back and made a really spectacular return, above all in these milieux. But at the same time, this flare-up of a virulent form of anti-Semitism in Arab Muslim circles exists in a certain context. And I believe that George Bensoussan has quite rightly underscored the complicity of a certain left, of a certain circle, those who want to feel good about things, anti-Semites who, in the name of human rights and humanism and progress, support anti-Semitism, but they refuse the title, vehemently deny they're anti-Semites, but nevertheless they do allow a climate to flourish where one can no longer say things as they are. It's a kind of climate which applies in an almost totalitarian fashion in people's mind. They have this terror of calling a spade a spade. And then I'd like to add something else, which is an element which I think hasn't been sufficiently referred to here, and that's the role of the media. Every time I come to France, and it's not something unusual for France, it exists all throughout the whole of Western Europe, indeed throughout the whole of the European Union today. It's the way in which the media today report the conflict in the Middle East, the way in which they talk about the Jews generally speaking, this pro-Palestinianism and this Palestine, not phobia indeed, but philia, making the Palestinians into a sacred cause. This, I believe, has made it possible for all of this slippage to take place that wasn't possible, even well, certainly 30 years ago wasn't possible. This media going along with this, even though the Palestinians, the Arabs, the Muslims generally, we're talking here about enormous partisan units. If a priori they're considered innocent because they're victims, and that's the thesis that's been addressed here, then raised here this evening, if they're victims, well, obviously someone has to be the guilty party, and the guilty party is very clear, and that's the awful thing. Again, it's the Jews who are the guilty party, and above all, Israel. Israel is guilty by definition. Israel is always in the dock. Israel is a criminal conspiracy a priori. So in that atmosphere, everything is allowed. Words lose their value, and that means we're instantly in an almost in a quasi-totalitarian system. But there's something else. We must ask ourselves why, and I know it is referred to in the book, why the Jews represent a preferred target, and above all, in circles of young Maghrebians, those who are alienated, marginalized, who feel themselves excluded from society, from French society. Why are the Jews the preferred target? There are a number of possible explanations. I think that the thesis is partly true when it says that the Jews represent, for the young Maghrebians, represent the values of the West. To some extent, they represent France. But there's something else as well, which is more immediate, which perhaps plays an even stronger role here. And that's the fact that populations in France today, Arab and Jews populations alike, to a large extent come from the Maghreb. Hence, there's a kind of competitive edge or element here. I think it's difficult to deny that for a young Maghreban who may be jobless, who hasn't really done well at all, to put it mildly, in the school system, who feels inferior, the shock is particularly major because coming from Maghreb, where the dimitude policy meant that the Jews always had to be inferior. Now the Jews, and it's quite obvious after more than 150 years, the Jews on the whole, they're a success story, a brilliant success story in France. So if you take the young Arabs' imaginations, they find this quite impossible to understand. They're really taken aback and shocked. There's jealousy, anger, rage against this phenomenon. For those Maghrebans who've come to France, they were above all working population. They're not particularly educated people. They were the laboring classes, so the difference is so enormous. It's really quite shocking, literally. Literally is inconceivable also in the context of the current values of Islam. Islamism, certainly fundamental Islam. The problem is that among the pretexts that are advanced in major detail in Bensoussan's book, the pretext or excuses for not tackling the real problems posed by anti-Semitism, very often one of the references is to the idea that ultimately it's just a question of tensions between different communities, as if the major targets, explanations and obstacles, stumbling blocks to resolving the problem of anti-Semitism, are simply a question of overcoming the communal divide. Now, when I hear this phrase, particularly because I have this Anglo-Saxon background, I have to say at first I was fairly mystified. What is this question of communitarism in Britain, in the US? Whether you're talking about the Jews or Muslims or any other minority immigrants, that's standard. That's exactly the way to deal with the problem, to allow immigration, let's say the Muslims in Britain, well, to let them speak their own languages, not just one language, because there isn't an Arab majority around them. And in fact, there are subsidies even provided to schools, and community identity is actually encouraged. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best solution. It's a different heritage, it's a different legacy, a different approach. But in France, every single time this debate takes place, I hear reference to this problem. It becomes a reproach and even an accusation. Communitarism, above all the Jews. Well, that really has you scratching your head, I have to say. Now, I've heard the figures that have been referred to here. The Jewish community of France is not communitarist. So this really is a fiction. The problem is the Maghreb community. And above all, the preachers of hatred who've been able to gain the upper hand, unfortunately because of a major silence by others. And the absence now of a moderate form of Islam. Certainly there is no such presence. Maybe it exists somewhere, but there's been no identifying of it. One more point. To come back to the question of the French left and the intellectuals, the academy. There is, of course, an extreme left which tries to see in the Palestinian cause a kind of substitute for the proletarian revolution, which never took place. The Palestinians, therefore, for let's say the last 30 years, have thus, for that left, become the great hope, great white hope, for subverting and changing and transforming the status quo. Now, what I find really quite astonishing, maybe this is really a question of the limits of an Israeli perspective, is how after so many failures, so many dramas, one can see exactly where the Intifada has led the Palestinian people to. Questions of corruption. The last thing, as with Arafat, perhaps he was going to tell us something about this. There hasn't been even the beginnings of a new appreciation that perhaps people were wrong, that perhaps this cause, which is, after all, at the origin of quite a few problems which are currently facing the Jews of France, that, as I was saying, perhaps everything that people thought than a utopia, and indeed a nightmare, true, took people an awful long time to wake up and stop being so complacent about totalitarian regimes in the past, and you did refer to that, Georges. So one asks oneself, what is needed for this moment of revelation to come, for the light to dawn, as it were? I think that ultimately what's going on in schools shows that they are the most primary and the most brutal microcosm of what is going on. It's a future, I think it's a pretty gloomy one, and I believe that the Jews of France, seen from this distance at least, this is how it looks to me, the Jews of France are starting to become aware of this. I do believe that you've today sketched a picture for us which leaves us in no doubt whatsoever, for those who were possibly in any doubt before, as to the seriousness of this crisis that is affecting and afflicting French schools. Thank you. Don't go, don't go, don't go. Don't go. No farewell symphony. Won't keep you here too long. But we're here to reply to your questions. There's a microphone over there. You can ask them. Yes, in just a moment. But before your questions, there's the question that was asked by Simcha Epstein before. What are the Jews doing? Why given this atmosphere of violence and hatred and rejection, why don't the Jews ask themselves this fundamental question about their identity? Who are us? Where are we from? Where are we going to? Whither? Jews of France. You'll be much better up here. And of course, the interpreters can't interpret anything that they don't hear through their headphones, so they need a microphone. Very tiresome, but it's facts of physics. Replying to the question by Simcha Epstein, well, that's a tricky one. I really don't have any remit, not from the CRIF, not by Naissance Consistoire, not by any Jewish institution to reply with Jews of France, but I'll be very brief so that I can leave you maximum time to speak. So I think what I would say is this. The Jews of France are worried. That won't teach you anything. I would say that they're really quite traumatized by what's going on. It's catastrophic. You can no longer organize any discussion in France on any the anti-Semitic wave without the public, after 15 minutes, bringing you back to the anti-Semitic wave that's going on, Judeophobia. As to the worries of the Jews of France, you know perfectly well here that there's been all sorts of people coming from France as tourists last summer. People are buying flats to be on the safe side. To reply more specifically to Simcha Epstein's question just now, I think I'd say the following. The Judeophobic wave is affecting a country which it's affecting the Jewish community. It's probably the least ready to listen to Zionism for the very good reason that until now, France is less so today, for reasons where I agree with Robert Wistrich. It's a Jacobin framework, and a Jacobin framework can no longer cannot accept the existence of any identity in itself. For the Zionism talks about another identity, and that means that the French Zionist contribution is very minor. So that's where the Jews of France stand, except that today the Jacobin framework and is really collapsing left, right, and centre. So it's not just the crisis of France that's affecting the French Jews, it's the crisis of France that's affecting French Jews. A large number of non-Jewish French people have their doubts as to what's happening to their country. They say France is screwed. I'm not the person that says that. It's what a number of French intellectuals are saying. French is screwed. Well, I was just looking where the voice was coming from. That was Emmanuel Halperin. That's what a number of Jews say as well. This is something I don't go along with, but one thing is certain, that is that there's a major crisis going on here. And really, certainly the elites are tending to undertake a general exodus, not just the Jews. There's a book called The Falling of France, or Falling France, and they are saying the elites are no longer being elitish. And to come back to Zionism, I would say that the Jacobin view of the nation and the Jacobin disintegration is perhaps allowing the French Jews to re-establish or redefine their Jewish identity. And unlike what happened in the 50s, for example, and even more before the war, what we're seeing is increase in interest in Jewish identity, Zionism, and so on. But let me add one last point, because behind this question of what the French Jews of France are doing, why aren't they immigrating in mass, why aren't they coming, there's something you mustn't forget. There's something very straightforward and absolutely silly. Social status. The Jews of France represent a privileged community. They're very well off. 75% of household heads have a very high educational levels. Why do you want them to be forced into making Aliyah? If they make Aliyah out of ideal, obviously you'll always have a small number of them, but if you want them to be forced into making Aliyah, far worse things have to happen in France than are happening now. We're not on the eve of Kristallnacht. Well, you can queue up there one after the other. First of all, George, I want to congratulate you on your masterly performance and presentation of the situation. There's just one point that I don't entirely agree with you, where I'd like to raise this, to put the situation on a more global level, that is the world level. What's going on in France is an extreme, because France is in a unique position where it has both the largest Arab and Muslim community in the world outside an Arab country, and also the second largest Jewish community in the world after the US. So it's that unique combination which is responsible for the fact that the problem has become such an important one as it is in France. But the second point follows on from the first. In your presentation, you took Maghreb history as one of the explanations for why, or the position of anti-Semitism in the Muslim setting, but I disagree with you. I think it's far more linked with the situation in the Middle East. And one of the proofs of this is that anti-Semitic discourse is to be found in countries where there aren't any Jews, where there's never been any Jews. Malaysia, Indonesia, Pakistan, where never been Jewish populations. They have this. There's the same anti-Semitic discourse, and this is basically driven them by, and it's a consequence of what's going on in the Middle East. It's never existed before. Okay, what we're going to do is this. All of this is very complex. We're going to do the following. We will allow the questions to be asked. You ask your questions one after the other, and then Georges, you take note of this, and then you reply en bloc to whatever questions are of interest to you, like General de Gaulle. He sorted things. Good evening, everyone. First of all, I want to refer to a very fresh, recent event which happened with Arafat. This adulation, which Arafat was the subject or object of, not to say the euphoria at his burial, funeral service, with all of the guards of honor and so on. Don't you think that's an action designed to delegitimize the state of Israel in the eyes of the whole of France, in front of the whole people, all of the television and so on? That's my first question. Secondly, can't the Jews go on a sort of counter-offensive? For example, state very firmly that there aren't the protocols of the elders of Zion, but that there are protocols of the elders of Islam, which are threatening the West, and all of these videos from Bin Laden prove that it's not the Jews who are a threat to the West, but the Arabs and the Islamists. Cannot they say that everything that the Jews who have helped the humanity, mankind with in the last X hundred years in the area of sciences and agriculture and so on, contrasting with these people, to say, and I would dare to say, they're basically animals. I'll use the term. Well, briefly, I want to ask Mr. Bensoussan the following. You talked about the Al-Mala channel. There's another one which is looked at by even more people, France 2, and we know that they broadcast the set-up version of the death of Mohammed al-Dura, and there was also their coverage. Just two little points. We haven't heard a great deal of reference made to the community leaders, the leaders of the Jewish community, and what they've done, what they haven't done. It's true that they took an awful long time to grasp what was going on, that during the whole of the first part up to 2002, they tried to say what's going on isn't against the Jews, it's against the state of Israel, and we have to have understanding for this and so on. Second point that also wasn't referred to is this. To some extent, part of this hostility is also directed against the Americans, and the Israelis and the Jews are perceived as the allies of the Americans, and hence as a fairly valid target for these attacks in France, because there are not enough Americans, and therefore they can be attacked. Well, I'm sure you all want to go and have dinner, so I think that's enough questions, and we'll let Georges Bensoussan reply briefly, not just briefly and succinctly, but I trust he will answer all of the questions that have been asked. Well, I'll do my level best. Let me take the questions in order. As for France being a very special instance, because it's got the largest French population in Western Europe, true. It has certainly it has the biggest Maghreb population in Europe. It's 1 to 10, the numbers here. That's the ratio you must remember. But I still maintain my analysis, that is to say that this community is not an Arab community from the Near East or the Middle East. It's not a Muslim population from Pakistan or Iran or Turkey, for example. What you note is this. Unlike what the doxa said, that is to say that overall we have a wave of Judeophobia coming from Islam in France. No, it doesn't come from Islam in France. It comes from part of the Maghreb Arab world. Turkish Islam or black African Islam doesn't have any problem with the Jews other than the odd phenomenon. It's with the Arab world that there's a problem, and specifically with the Maghreb world for the reason that Egyptian or Iraqi immigration into France is minor and modest. Now, in the Maghreb, pre- and post-colonization society, there was an attitude and a culture. There was an attitude that was very major in terms of making the Jews victims, victimization. Constantine, 1924, I'm not telling you that. Fairs, 1912, you know about that as well. I come back to my example before last spring when, for reasons to do with my own personal work, I had to go into the Alliance's archives on the Moroccan case. I found documents, most awful documents about the conditions of the Jews in Morocco before the French came. I was totally taken aback because I came out of the archives and I went out into the street and I said we're a long way away from the dimitude. That's the doxa, totally simplistic, but there was a totally different picture in the archives. There was a conference organized to protect the Jews of Morocco. The Alliance representatives came to Paris and said, if we don't do anything, if Paris isn't mobilized, then the Jewish Moroccan community will be finished. There were the most awful amounts of assassinations, murders, and so on. When the French came, they were welcomed like liberators. Memoirs of French generals said we didn't understood why we were welcomed with open arms by the Jews when we came to the particular villages and towns and so on. What was the reason for this? There was a tradition which is hidden from us by the doxa, including by a large number of Moroccan Jews who said we lived in perfectly good terms. We were very happy. It's quite clear that you have to forget that Epinelesque view. It wasn't hell, on the other hand. It was dimitude. Stay in your place, be a good boy, be an inferior, and nothing bad will happen to you. The idea of dimitude is vital to understand both what's going on in France today, because there is a resurgence of dimitude, and the Moroccan chief rabbis come and said, what I left behind in Morocco when I was a child, I'm finding here. And the chief rabbi in France is very open to dialogue with the Islamic representative. But if he says it's dimitude, then I think we have to accept it. The dimension of the dimitude back there in Morocco is one of the basic reasons for the conflict that's going on here now. But this is not our area this evening. As to Chirac, Arafat, and so on, there was a really profound feeling that we had in France to the effect that President Chirac did a great deal too much, but that attitude, that perception was also that of the non-Jews. Don't believe that it was just the Jewish community that was totally taken aback by what happened the last days of Arafat's days. What happened with the Republican Guard that accompanied Arafat on his last journey, that was totally horrifying, not just to the Jews, but to many parts of France. A large proportion of the French population didn't agree to the humanitarian acceptance or hospitality that was extended, nor what happened afterwards. As far as the president of the Republic is concerned, there's a basic ambiguity here. Chirac has tackled head-on this problem of anti-Semitism, as Halperin said. I would say Jacques Chirac is probably sincere. He's someone who doesn't have the slightest whiff of anti-Semitism about him. His advisors received us at the Élysée 3 times. He received us last December personally, but I would say the following as well. One cannot have such an outrageously partisan attitude and not set fire to the flames. There's a contradiction here, and you just can't walk that tightrope. I will say that if today the authorities of the French Republic are very worried, and it's very sincere, this, it's not out of love for the Jews. It's not out of concern for the Jews. It's because they understand that the social tissue of this country is basically unraveling like a knitted garment. And if you go back to the Dreyfus affair, you see that the government camp insisted that the trial be reopened, and they brought him back from Devil's Island, and they understood the reason was because they understood this time it wasn't the Jews that were in danger, but it was the very existence of the establishment of France, which was under attack from the clericalist and right-wing circles. And the reason now why they are worried, the French authorities are worried, and why they're reacting is because they can see the Republic is unraveling. I'm not saying there isn't a genuine concern to put an end to this plague of anti-Semitism. Again, you have to look and realize that there are many senior officials who are very sincere about this, but this two-level language is very confusing. Dominique de Villepin had a private dinner. In other words, the person closest to the President of the Republic at the time, he was Secretary General at the Élysée, he said that the state of Israel will pass into history just as the Crusades did. And that proves that in the French media today also there's this really deep-rooted belief in the ephemeral nature of Israel. That is the and that's the atmosphere of the time in Israel, and that's atmosphere of the time in France at the moment. That's really dangerous. You talked about stressing the 300 years of contributions that the French have made, the Jews have made to France. It's a waste of time completely. First of all, because facts are of no interest to anyone. Nobody gives a damn about facts. When facts contradict ideology, as I said before, ideology wins out. This is a totalitarian framework and thinking process. Facts have nothing to do with it. When you say to me, you have to show the contribution that the Jews have made to France, to the Republic, Marcel Proust, and Bergson, and so on, it's nothing. You're just out of order, as it were. Very, very simple. You're speaking rationally. You have to deal with anti-Semitism, which is a collective paranoia. You're wrong. You're always going to be wrong because however you reason, your big mistake is you exist. So don't waste your time reasoning here. Reason on a different level. What is it that drives these people? What are the intellectual mechanisms of this collective paranoia which leads to this delirium? How can one counter the delirium? As a teacher of history at school, I never wasted a single moment of my classes in saying the revisionists are wrong, the gas chambers existed. No point wasting time on that. But so I don't spend any time on revisionism. But I would tackle things as follows. I would say, what do the revisionists, what are they thinking of in trying to show that this doesn't exist, just as if tomorrow I said that the Great War, the Battle of Verdun, didn't exist? What's their ideology? What they're trying to show? What drives them? What's in their head? Not trying to reason with them. And another, I know I'm going on a bit too long, but go back to, if you go back to 80 at the beginning of a revision of Fournisson and so on, talked about gas chambers not existing. Georges Villiers, one of the Auschwitz survivors, very honest fellow. He wrote a book which I really, it makes my hair stand on end now. The gas chambers existed, published by Gallimard. What did it prove? Whom did it assuage? And then later a book was published, about the Racinier, wonderful title, The Fabrication of an Anti-Semite, 1980s. the gas chambers existed, but they're not interested in the gas chambers having existed. But the question is, how do things develop in the head of an anti-Semite? That's the interesting point. And I think that 20 years later, we've done very well in France. We've stopped wasting our time with revisionism, and now we're focusing on the mechanisms that lead to revisionism. That's why I said facts are irrelevant. Another last thing about irrelevant facts. Last year, March, at the CDGC, where I work in Paris, we produced an enormous volume, and Robert Wistrich knows very well about this, or knows a great deal about this, because he made a contribution with regard to revisionism. Revisionism was a pretext term. We are historians of the Shoah. Revisionism, anti-Semitism in the Arab Muslim world. It's a work that, with a lot of translations, a summary mainly by Israeli academics, was a great repercussion in the field. Oh, I'm waiting for comment in the press, on the radio. Just two references. There's one man who said it's an amazing volume and it has to be read. Makes your hair stand on end. One person from France Culture asked us to talk about the reviews in just 10 minutes on a Sunday morning. The facts are overwhelming. You can't read this volume and not be the same and be the same person at the end. But apparently no one was interested in it. That's the real point. When totalitarian thinking is before you, you have to tackle things differently. You can't reason. You have to think, use reason in a different way. Now, the last thing, the future of the Jewish community, someone asked about that. Two very brief things. Before 2000 and before the flare-up, the anti-Semitic flare-up, which is the anti-Semitic explosion, really wasn't the beginning. And then we've said that in the territories. Go back to 93, 94. I saw it then when professors in high schools in the Parisian suburbs, they said it's very interesting to teach Holocaust, but, and they started going blah, blah, blah. But ultimately they said what was going on. This was 94, and today they say it's the collapse of the peace process that explains this. It was Oslo in 94, right in the midst of Oslo, despite all the slippage, but nevertheless the wave is taking off, and then suddenly the second explosion, the second intifada took out, and the journalists were impressed and they concluded that was the source. Let me say two things about Jewish leaders. Back in 94, 2000, no one listened to us. Nobody listened to us. We were listened to politely. We were given a cup of coffee. They said, thank you very much, goodbye. We left the offices. We felt that we were just OTT, over the top, paranoid. And then the wave got going, and some of them understood very clearly what was going on. Some of them, not all of them. Why in certain Jewish circles were people unprepared to accept the problem? I don't want to give names here, not here to engage in polemics, but I was given the map of anti-Semitic incidents in Paris. Enormous concentration on the eastern side, where the Jewish working classes exist, where they're in contact with the Maghreb classes, where a child will be attacked, rabbis attacked in the street, but that's not where the Jewish hoi polloi live. They live in the 6th arrondissement, 16th in Nouvelle-Boulogne. I'm not talking class here, I'm just saying what the facts are. Politically, they may be very incorrect, but you have to say how things are, and if you don't say that, then you can move on to other subjects. But if you talk about that topic, then you've got to call a spade and say, yes, some responded for fairly elementary class reasons, and they were unprepared to see this because they're not faced by this problem. Because when you have your law office in the 8th arrondissement and you go home to the 16th, there's no danger at all of you running into an anti-Semitic danger. The reality, I'm not saying this is the only part of the response, but I think it's a vital one. I know it's very trivial and banal and prosaic, and some even think it's very crude, but it exists. Thank you. That's it. Thank you very much. If you could just stay just one more moment, 2 minutes. I just want to ask you a last question to conclude, because you have to have a conclusion. Historians of anti-Semitism, we have 3 historians of anti-Semitism here, after all, share something very special which distinguishes them from other historians, that they're engaged, they're involved. They're historians who don't simply analyze the past, but they are also involved in analyzing the present in order to warn their readers, to warn those interested in their work with regard to the future. This is very special. Not many historians are in that particular set of circumstances. They're historians who are involved in a struggle. Now, Georges Bensoussan, I'd like to ask you, over and beyond the struggle for truth and justice that was fought by Zola in the Dreyfus affair, what precisely is your struggle what's your fight as a historian? Are you fighting for the Jews or for the Republic? Okay. This is a very difficult question because it's a very personal one you've just asked me. I would put it like this, and I'm going to be brutally frank. I would say for both. I don't need to justify why I'm fighting for the Jews. I really believe very deeply in the existence of a Jewish people, a Jewish nation, whatever you like to call it. As far as to fight for the Republic, this is because this is a concept I believe in. France is a country I believe in because the French homeland is one that I love deeply, because the French language is my language, it's the language that I love, because my country is the one that is being stolen from me every day. Like thousands of Jews of France today, I'm starting to be an orphan of my homeland, my mother country. And I have to say, this is a situation that is impossible to live in. Thank you all.